Shabbat Shalom. Good morning, everyone. I am Rabbi Jenny Greenspan here for Congregation Beth-El doing our weekly Shabbat morning Torah Talk, knowing that some of you will get to be joining us live in the sanctuary in a little bit. So I may have slightly fewer live viewers this Shabbat morning than usual, but that is perfectly okay. I am so excited to actually see some folks in person, to still greet those of you that I am seeing here, and to know that the videos, as usual, are always available still on Facebook and on YouTube. But I'll say Shabbat Shalom and good morning to the Sclares and to the Seagulls. To Renee Faust, Shabbat Shalom, good morning. We are this week looking at Parashat Pinchas, named for the grandson of Aaron, son of Eliezer, Pinchas, who's really got into a bit at the end of last week's Torah portion and into this week's Torah portion. I'm not going to focus on him so much as one of my favorite stories in the entire Torah a little bit later on in this week's Torah portion. But regardless, you can find, as usual, a copy of the Torah portion in a PDF of the Etz Chaim Chumash on the Beth-El website. Just go to bez613.org. Go over to those virtual Shabbat resources and select the Torah Talk resources, where you'll find a PDF. If you are using an Etz Chaim Chumash at home, go ahead and grab that. And if you are using a different Etz Chaim, or a different Chumash than the Etz Chaim, I will be beginning on Numbers chapter 27, verse 1 today. So if you are in the Etz Chaim Chumash, it's on page 925, whether you're in the PDF or the physical copy of the book. But I'll say Shabbat Shalom and welcome. It's so good to see everybody. Shabbat Shalom and welcome to Jim Hammonds and to Jim Roth and to Ellen Hamburger. So good to still see you here, and looking forward to seeing some in person soon. So let's jump in. So this Torah portion, as I mentioned, is called Pinchas, so named for Aaron, the high priest's grandson, Eliezer's son. And Pinchas is famous for when he found we mentioned it last week a little bit, because it's really the end of last week's Torah portion and bleeds into this week's Torah portion, found an Israelite and a Moabite cohabiting, and kills the two of them as a way to preserve his view of the purity of the Israelite people. And at the beginning of this one, he is given a covenant of peace, a Brit Shalom. So it's an interesting thing to look at, to explore. The Vav in the Shalom, the Hebrew letter Vav that normally looks like a straight line, has a bit of a break in many Torah scrolls. This portion actually has at least two slightly different textual variants with the lettering. So there's lots of comments on perhaps his Brit Shalom is to remind him to try to seek peace, and that the peace that he already seeks is a bit broken, as an interpretation I have seen for that broken Vav in Pinchas's Brit Shalom. After we see the story of Pinchas, we get a bit of information about the sacrifices, and then we arrive at one of my favorite stories in the entire Torah, and certainly in the entire book of Numbers. We arrive at the story of the daughters of Zelophehad. So join me on page 925 in the Etz Chaim Chumash, or in Numbers chapter 27, verse 1 of any Chumash that you might be following along with. The daughters of Zelophehad, of the Manassite family, son of Chefer, son of Gilad, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, son of Joseph, came forward. The names of the daughters were Machla, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah. They stood before Moses, Eliezer the priest, who's, by the way, Pinchas' father, the chieftains, and the whole assembly at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they said, "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not one of the faction, Korach's faction, when we learned about a few weeks ago, which banded together against God, but died of his own sin, and he's left no sons. Let not our father's name be lost to his clan, just because he had no son. Give us a holding among our father's kinsmen." I'll pause there to point to what we are looking at so far. So we're looking at, for the Torah's age, a somewhat radical story here. We have 5 women, all of whom seem to be unmarried, who are sisters to one another, and who have no brothers, who've lost their father, They're saying the current inheritance law as it's set, that the land ability to own land can only pass from father to son or father to different male kinsmen, is unfair, and they don't think that their father deserves to be erased and disappeared by his land moving off to perhaps a brother of his or a nephew of his, rather than his own children. And they are saying, as women, they want to inherit that land. In front of, by the way, Moses, Eleazar the priest, and all of the chieftains and the whole assembly. They've gathered up in front of the entirety of the people with power. Every single person in power seems to be assembled here as they state this, noting multiple times that their father has passed away. He did so in the wilderness, and that he was not a part of the uprising against Moses and the other leaders previously. I want us to think about, before we go into the next part of the story, have you ever in your life, I think many of us have at this point, experienced having something that you thought was a social given called into question and lead to upheaval? I think many of us have experienced this in our lifetimes. For example, my mother-in-law recently gave me an old Hadassah book called Treasures for My Daughter, a collection of recipes for holidays, for Shabbat, and for a Brit Milah and a Bar Mitzvah, but nothing about a Simchat Bat or a Bat Mitzvah for someone's daughter, because this book was written in the 1950s. The original book was the original version of the book, at least, was copyright 1950. In that particular frame of world, they didn't really imagine the idea that perhaps, like is in my household, it might be the husband who tends to be the one caring for Shabbat meals and for holiday meals, or that there may be two husbands or two wives in a home. It didn't really occur to them because the world has changed since then. I want us to think about the experience of having what you thought was a social given. It's just, this is how it is, called into question. Bring up that experience and think about the emotions attached to it. Most of the time, the initial reaction, the first feelings reacting to the world being different than we think it is doubt, disbelief, is unsettlement, resentment, resistance, fear. So here we have, I want us to take a moment and put ourselves in the minds, not of the daughters, whom I usually like to focus on, but in the minds of Moses, of Eleazar, of all of the chieftains, and what might they be feeling when they have these 5 women standing before them calling into question the reality as they know it and what should be. Just hold on to that for a moment as we continue forward at verse 5 on page 927 in the Etz Chaim. Moses brought their case before God. Moses seems to not know how to respond. And God said to Moses, the plea of Zelophehad's daughters is just. It's correct. In Hebrew, Kain banot Zelophehad dobrot. Kain means yes, right. It just unquestionably, yep, correct. The plea of Zelophehad's daughters is just. You should give them a hereditary holding amongst their father's kinsmen, transfer their father's share to them. Furthermore, speak to the Israelite people as follows. If a man dies without leaving a son, you shall transfer his property to his daughter. If he has no daughter, you shall assign his property to his brothers. If he has no brothers, you shall assign his property to his father's brothers. If his father had no brothers, you shall assign his property to his nearest relative in his own clan, and he shall inherit it. This shall be the law of procedure for the Israelites in accordance with God's command to Moses. So God says, yes, the daughters are correct. The ruling as they are requesting is what should be, and God gives some more details as to what it can be. And I'll note that we say this is just. This is often used as a story to point toward justice and a movement towards justice, and I think it is, and clearly it's not all the way there yet, because note that it's not, if he has no brothers, give it to his sister. That's not what seems to happen. So it's not a full move toward equality and egalitarianism, toward gender equality at least here, but it's a step. So I want to now think about how it could have been, how that step could have happened. Starting with that feeling of perhaps Moses and Eliezer and all of the others are feeling a bit resistant here. They have had what they assume is the norms of society called into question. Moses could have reacted by saying, that's just not how it works. Sorry. And yet they don't. And so I want to pull on a teaching I learned recently from the Sifrei, one of the oldest commentaries on the Torah, which says something quite interesting. The compassion that God experiences is not the same as the compassion that human beings experience. Because when human beings experience compassion, they experience it more for men than for women, the Sifrei says. But when God experiences compassion, God experiences it equally for men and for women. I think noting that the Sifrei is one of our oldest commentaries, coming from one of the early centuries, this era, of the Common Era, may not mean necessarily men versus women, but it is pointing to a very human tendency that even our compassion comes from a place of bias. We've done studies that point to the fact that in human beings, whether or not we mean well, we tend to offer more compassion toward people that we perceive to be like us than we do to people whom we perceive to be unlike us. So for the Sifrei to say men versus women, the Sifrei was written by men. So perhaps that is what they are getting at. But we still do this, even when we want to be in a world of justice and to offer equality and equity for all. There is still something in our psychology that will tend to offer more compassion toward people we perceive to be more similar to us than we perceive to be more different from us, whether that's a racial or a gender or a wealth level, whatever it might be. And here Moses gets through that. He resists that feeling in himself, because he could have said, sorry, yeah, you guys are a bunch of women. I don't feel it the same way. This is what the law is. And instead, Moses turns to God and asks for God's answer. God, we remember, the Sifrei says, has equal compassion for all human beings. To God, we are all God's children. We are all made in the image of God. And so God, I like to believe, asked Moses to hear each of the statements that the daughters made with an ear toward compassion. He said, hear them, listen to them, have compassion when they say, their father died in wilderness, probably alone. He was not one of the faction of Korach's faction. He didn't really have a clan that he grouped together with, even if that was a rebellious clan. He died of his own sin. Something he did caused him to be lost. And please don't let his name be lost to his people just because he didn't have sons. Moses manages to listen to turn to God and ask for help in hearing them. And Moses manages to offer compassion to the statements that they have and to allow God to say, yes, they are right, and it is time to make a move and a shift in the law. This is also a reminder that law can shift and grow and change, always in a movement toward equality and toward justice. I think another lesson we can hold on to from this week's Torah portion and from this powerful story that I love returning to over and over again is that we also need to learn how to cultivate a godly kind of compassion in ourselves. When we want to adjust law and culture toward justice, we also need to cultivate that feeling of compassion for all, of finding a way to offer compassion even to those that we initially perceive to be a little too different from ourselves, that we don't quite know. And so as I cannot remember her name, but I heard it on a podcast several months ago, on the podcast called Terrible, thanks for asking, an addiction expert was reminding us that in order to have compassion for all, we just have to seek, just have to look for something that we can find a connection on. And if we can find a connection and feel more like one another, then we can offer compassion and recognize the humanity in every single person we encounter, and we can move our own gut reaction of compassion from being human and biased to being godly and unbiased. So leave us here. We'll say Shabbat Shalom, and thank you so much for joining me. Shabbat Shalom also from the Wises and to Phyllis Luger. So good to see you as well. Say a beautiful Shabbat, a beautiful week, a week where we all have as much unbridled, unbiased, holy compassion as we possibly can. Say Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much for joining me. At 10 o'clock, the live stream will still be active. So if you've signed up to join us in person, I look forward to seeing you. And if you are going to continue to join us on the live stream for this week, you just go to bez613.org/watch live. Shabbat Shalom, and I look forward to seeing you soon.